You know, that never living in Washington part is really important, because when you don't live in Washington, you hear what people really talk about. And while it's not as dramatic between a state capital and your folks back home, it's really important to remember that we live in a bubble. I want to start with a very simple premise. I look at a lot of data, probably as much as anybody on the planet. I look at polls, some that I agree with, some that I conduct, some that I grumble about. But what comes through loud and clear to me is that America's best days are still to come. I am very optimistic by what I see in the data. I know that my kids, and if I'm ever lucky enough to have grandchildren, will live in a better world, partly because the American people are still committed to those founding ideals of freedom, equality, and self-governance. Sometimes it's hard to see, and look, we're going through tough times as a nation right now, but voters are making the adjustment. When we talk about the pandemic that our leaders said could not have come from a lab leak in Wuhan, China, a majority of voters overwhelmingly say, yes, that's the first place we should look. They're also very skeptical. In fact, a majority of voters, 57%, say they think our government not only helped fund some of that, but helped cover it up. So there is a continuing skepticism about government, and that means they're also skeptical of every legislator in this room. And that's a good thing. You should be prepared to have people challenge you and wonder about which side you're really on, and you should strive to live up to their trust. Another reason that I'm really optimistic, we've talked a lot about education at this conference. A couple of years ago, before the pandemic, if I asked about homeschooling, it was treated as a pariah topic. It was those things that crazy Christians did, but it wasn't really good for the children. Today, after people went through 2 years of actually seeing what went on in schools, homeschooling is considered a very viable option. Not only that, 40% of parents who have kids in public schools say they're open to considering other options. Pretty encouraging. Now, not all 40% are going to switch. Not all would go to homeschooling. There are charter schools, and there's pods, and there's all kinds of things out there. But parents are beginning to recognize that they have that choice. When we talk about something like education, though, our tendency is to go right for the details. And some people in this room have probably complained about the teaching of critical race theory, or CRT, in their schools. And that's a good thing to complain about, but you should never talk about it that way to anybody outside of this room. And the reason for that is voters do not know what CRT means. Only 8% of voters talk politics on a daily basis. They are not familiar with the code words that we use. They don't like the substance of what critical race theory is, but they don't know the terminology. So as you go out and begin to talk about messaging, you have to begin to focus on what the listener is expecting, the terms that they use. And again, that's why I live outside of DC. Every now and then, my wife and I play music in a dive bar called the Whistle Stop Bar and Grill. And I will tell you, you learn more about public opinion at the Whistle Stop than you do at a convention like this. That's just part of life. You have to be able to connect with people who are speaking a different language. What the American people are committed to is freedom, equality, and self-governance, but they need our help to make that a reality, to restore that in America. There's encouraging things happening in the state of Arizona with education. There's encouraging things happening in the state of Virginia, where there's a pivot being made from protest to governance. But we still need to think about ways to talk about all of our issues. And I want to start by picking on federalism, limited government, and freedom, the mottos of ALEC. I think they're wonderful. If you leave this conference thinking that you need to convince people that those are what we're fighting for, you've already lost. The reality is, those are principles that we know are important. That's the inner workings of how to create a good society. But it is not the way you're communicating what we're doing. The difference is and a lot of policy wonks do this. If a policy wonk was selling Diet Coke, they would read the list of ingredients on the back. This is what Diet Coke is. A marketing person would say, this is this great, refreshing drink. It's good for you. It doesn't have all that sugary stuff. Now, the two have to work together. The marketing person has to convince people it's worth trying and worth enjoying, but the policy people have to back it up and actually make it work. In the political sense, what that means, freedom, limited government, federalism, those are the ingredients. But nobody cares about government. They don't care about limited government. The objective is not to create a government that works. It is to create a society that works. So when you go out and talk to people, you need to start from a premise of what matters to them. Last year, there was an effort by the Biden administration to pass what they called the Build Back Better bill, which was a mouthful. ALEC worked with us and with about 64 other organizations on the center-right coalition to fight that bill. And one of the things that we did early on was we looked at things that we thought would upset voters about it. And one group came up with a list of 42 offensive provisions in that bill. And I'll bet that if I shared all 42 with you, you would say they're offensive too. We went and polled on them, and about 36 of them were not offensive to the American people. So things that were bothering this group, that would bother you, that were bothering the coalition we were working with, didn't matter. Now, some people, they hear things like that, and they say, we need to explain to them why they're offensive. Well, that's good, that's logical, but when you're talking to an audience that rarely talks politics, and you have their attention for only brief moments of time, a better way to approach it is to focus on the 6 things that did offend people. And that's what we did. We talked relentlessly. Every organization that was part of this coalition reached out talking about some of the 6 items that moved it. And by the way, we thought we were doing great until Joe Manchin betrayed us a couple of days ago. But that effort was focusing on the issues that people cared about, not the issues that we cared about. That's the key to any effective messaging. Over this weekend, we're going to be doing some testing on the new bill that's coming out, and we're going to go back and do that exact same thing. So we're going to be talking to people, asking them what they care about, what offends them about this bill, and then we're going to make sure, especially that Senator Sinema and a few others are aware of what is troubling the American people about this. Always, always, always keep in mind what voters want to talk about. If education is your top issue, it's a great issue for Republicans this year. But talk about it, not in the narrow sense of critical race theory or something else. Talk about it in the way that will attract the biggest audience. Talk about it as we want parents to have more control. I'm going to take questions in a minute, but I'm going to do something that I can safely say nobody has ever done before at an ALEC conference. I am going to say that you should follow the model of Bill Clinton. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton worked on welfare reform. He had a way of framing it that I've never seen a poll like this before or since. 90% of the voters agreed with Bill Clinton's statement. Now, when I followed up, they all thought it meant something different. But he had a unifying way of getting a message across. When we apply that to the issues of today, if you talk about, well, the problem with schools is the standards are too low, or the problem with schools is the transgender issue, or the problem with schools is CRT, you're only getting a small fragment of that appeal. You want to talk about the bigger issue, which is parents are the ones who should direct the education of their children. Parents are the ones who should be passing on these values. If you do that, you might not get to the Bill Clinton 90% level, but you'll be pretty close, because that is a driving force in American politics. We have one great opportunity before us in this nation today. For most of my life, People on the political right have been identified with freedom. People on the political left have been associated with equality, and they're seen as butting heads, and it's kind of been a draw. In today's world, the political left is abandoning equality. They're moving to equity. Our movement to go forward and becoming a governing majority should become the movement of freedom and equality. Both values are there, both values resonate with the American people, and the field is wide open. We should find a way to capture that. And by the way, that's the way you make sure that government of, by, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. If there are any questions, there's some microphones roaming somewhere. If I don't like the question, I'll pretend I didn't hear it.
Your polls that you conduct seem to be amazingly accurate. Is there a specific methodology that you have that makes it so?
Polling methodology is a topic that I could stand here and bore you with for about 3 hours. One of the keys is making sure you reach a good sample of the population and talk to them in ways that they are used to communicating. You know, it used to be you'd call people on the phone, then answering machines got in the way, then these cell phones came along, and truly, think about this. If I were to call my kids on a cell phone, the first thing they'd say is, "What's wrong with mom?" Because nobody talks that way anymore. So we reach people through apps, we reach people through text, and then it's not so much the poll that is problematic, it is the way you interpret it. We just did a poll in Colorado, Senate race poll, and looked at the margins, but the key detail was that among people who were undecided, 82% of them disapprove of President Biden. You look at that and you say that means this race is going to be a lot closer than the polls indicate right now. Polls are a really helpful tool if they're well done, but don't expect them to tell you precisely what's going to happen. In Utah 4 in 2020, my last poll of the race shocked me and everybody else. It showed Burgess Owens winning by 1 point, and Burgess was kind enough to win by 1 point to make my poll look good. But the fact is that poll had a 3.5-point margin of error. It was not the tool to tell you who would win a 1-point race. It was the tool to tell you it would be close. Yes.
Hi, Scott. Lee Habib, Vice President of Content at Salem Media Group, and thanks for all you do and how you do it. You talked about polling and message. What about narrative and the sub-theme of story and themes? Talk about those things.
Sure. Numbers are really good to a data geek like me because I can look at numbers and they tell me a story. And I long ago learned, like Lee suggests, that most people don't relate to numbers. One of the things we talked about with the Build Back Better bill is never say it's trillions of dollars. That's a reason to vote against it. You have to connect with people on things that will make a lasting impression. You have to put your story into the narrative. When you're talking about a policy issue, it's not the dynamics, it's not the ingredients of the policy, it's how it will affect somebody's life. And then if you can put it into the narrative of how it helps the community life, into that storyline, well, that becomes even better. And if you can connect your policy, not just to why it'll make your community better, but how it taps into America's founding ideals, well, then you've got a real winner, again, because that connects with voters. One of the things that was mentioned in my intro was that I do what I call counter-polling, and that is simply a way to support storytelling in the way the American people would tell the story. Because most polls, when they ask about topics, they ask about the words as they're used in Washington, D.C. Most voters don't use those words. So we try to put things in, again, a different language that connects with the experience of everyday Americans. Is there one more?
I'm with Stop Inflating Us, and there's a few people in the country that are worried about inflation this cycle and how the federal debt might be driving that further. How do we cover that issue with the public?
People are concerned about inflation. In fact, I say the top 3 issues in this election are inflation, inflation, and inflation. And after you address inflation, Then you can talk about the issue near and dear to your heart, and if it's education or some of the other topics we've talked about, that's a winning issue, but you have to start with inflation. However, you don't have to explain how it happens. Steve Moore and I have this discussion all the time. He wants people to understand why inflation happens and what the process is. No, what people need to understand is they go to fill their tank and they can't afford it. Or if they do afford that, then they go to the grocery store and they can't afford that. The biggest thing that people do when they face inflation is they fill their gas tank, and when gas prices go up, they spend less on groceries. And for people who are a little bit more affluent, the biggest thing they cut back on is going out to eat. These are real-world discussions. What we need to do is connect what is happening in policy to what people are experiencing in their life. In West Virginia this past year, we found that 76% of voters believe that higher government spending leads to higher gas prices. That's the inflation story we need to tell. And I think I'm out of time, so on that note, thank you very much.